Back, and we'll proceed to a second round of questioning. We are up against votes, so we'll try to proceed as quickly as we can, and we'll see if the witnesses are available to remain. If we have to have a break for votes, we'll see if you can do that. But so I've at this time well, let me do this first. I want to, without objection, I want to submit for the record the graphic shown by Mr. Strong during his 5 minutes, the Facebook content request screen. And now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. So, Dr. Miller-Idriss, I want to sort of pursue where I left off and others have illustrated. I think you said, notwithstanding what you wrote, that we should continue to work with social media platforms to remove harmful and dangerous, I think was your terminology. And then you gave some examples, for example, a bomb threat or something like that. That's illegal speech, not protected by the First Amendment. But let me just clarify, because I think the concern is whether or not you're concerned about manipulation and propaganda and these sort of things, or maybe a subterfuge for subtle censorship. So let me get at it in this way. Do you believe that propaganda from foreign governments should be allowed on social media, and the federal government should take no effort to interfere with or facilitate its removal?
I believe that if there is disinformation circulating from foreign governments that is intended to harm our democracy, that should be removed. That should be removed.
Are you a lawyer?
No.
Well, okay, so there's a case called Lamont versus Postmaster General from 1965. It's old law in which the United States Supreme Court held that a United States citizen has a First Amendment right to foreign communist propaganda to come through the mails to us. Do you think communist propaganda might be harmful?
I think that I think I'm flattered that you think that my expertise extends that broadly to disinformation and propaganda across the spectrum. My expertise as a professor of education is about equipping communities with tools to reject harmful content.
And I'm not trying to be unfair. What I am trying to pin you down a little bit, because there's this notion, and I think Professor Turley's gotten to it some, but there's this notion out there that, well, we're not against, we want to preserve, I get this all the time. We're going to protect the First Amendment, protect everybody's First Amendment rights. But what I just was sharing with you is that there's a First Amendment right to propaganda, communist propaganda from abroad that's been established as long as I've been alive.
Yeah.
And so is that harmful? Is that within, do you include that? And I'm not trying to repeat the question. I am trying to say this. If you're trying to, you say you want to teach people what is manipulative and not to be manipulated, I have no problem about that. But you also are proposing to this committee that there's a massive government investment. Government should invest in you, frankly. Well, let me ask you this. You are funded by the Department of Homeland Security, right? Is anybody else here, by the way, funded by the Department of Homeland Security? You have funding from the National Science Foundation, is that correct?
I did.
You did? Okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah. The government, I think what concerns me is you seem to think that you are the right arbiter to decide what is misinformation, malinformation, which is actually true but somehow being misused for harm. Yeah. How do you arrogate that? I mean, I don't know if it's the wrong term. How do you assume that you should be the arbiter? With respect, you are on the left. There's a tweet from a couple days ago where you're talking about whiteness and how the Irish were not white and then became white. I mean, it seems to me to be fairly extreme, even by the standards I hear from my colleagues in the Democrat. Why should you be the arbiter to decide who needs to be protected from manipulation or propaganda?
I understand the question and your concern, and I should not be the arbiter as an individual. I run a research lab, and when we get asked to equip local communities with tools, we do a comprehensive mapping of all propaganda. We do interviews, focus groups with people. We figure out what that content is, and then we create the tools, and then we test it like we did, like I reported on here today. So I'm never putting my opinion into, I'm a columnist separately with an opinion, but I never put my opinion into the classroom or into the research tools that comes from a group of people who are hired to work on with their methodological expertise.
Let me see if I can get the professor in, Professor Turley, to deal with this, because it seems to me that, the notion that the government should take, with all respect, Dr. Miller-Idriss's view of what is manipulative or what is misinformation, and then have that sort of spread out to the public to teach them to be prepared is a recipe for disaster. Can you speak to that, Mr.
Well,
Professor
it's also tragically familiar. I'm just finishing a book on free speech now, and it goes back to England before the Revolution. And many of the rationales we use today actually came from not only England, but came from the Star Chamber. The Star Chamber was used to prosecute sedition, and they came up with this idea that there's, quote, bad tendency speech, that there's some speech that has a bad tendency. And that took hold in the United States. Even though many of the framers rejected it, it took hold with some early decisions. Holmes is a good example of losing his mind by talking about crying fire in a crowded theater, which he regretted. And that decision was later rejected by the Supreme Court. The government should not be in the disinformation business. It should not be trying to shape speech. It's a very clear line, and one that we have lost.
And one of the problems, and I'll turn it over in just a second, but one of the problems seems to me that people think it's a vague concept. They want to preserve the full right to speak, that the First Amendment, or the right to have access to information, and yet I'm not sure we know what that is. You've got to know what the law is before you know whether you're agreeing with it or you're doing something in violation of it, with all respect. So my time is more than expired. I yield to Mr.